were some of the presidents that were elected during the decade known as the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties? There were 3 presidents elected during this decade: Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. All 3 presidents were Republicans, and they all wanted the U.S. economy to grow even stronger. All 3 supported laissez-faire economic policies. Those are policies that favor big business, high tariffs, lower taxes on the wealthy, and little enforcement of antitrust laws. So government interference in the economy was limited during this time. Remember that Warren G. Harding had promised Americans a return to normalcy. He supported big business and U.S. isolation from foreign affairs. Serving only 3 years of his term, he stabilized the U.S. economy after the war. He promised less government in business and more business in government. He was an isolationist and preferred to keep the U.S. out of the League of Nations. During his administration, the emergency quota, emergency immigration law was passed. It restricted the number of immigrants coming from undesirable countries. This was a legislative response to the large number of immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. It restricted their immigration into the United States. Under Harding's presidency, taxes were lowered, especially for the wealthy and for businesses. Immigration was limited, and he enacted high protective tariffs. He also supported prohibition. Remember the prohibiting of alcohol? He supported that as a great experiment. Harding's era was one of the lowest points in American history for race relations. In reaction against the Great Migration, whites rioted against blacks throughout northern communities. And the recently revived Ku Klux Klan rose in popularity after the release of Birth of a Nation, the movie Birth of a Nation, as President Harding spoke out against the Klan. So remember the African-American migration from the South up into other areas of the country. Okay, this is what we're talking about here when we talk about the African-American migration. While he was in office, there was a scandal known as the Teapot Dome scandal. It was a bribery scandal that involved his Secretary of the Interior, a man named Albert Fall, and he was leasing Navy petroleum reserves at a place called Teapot, Wyoming. It's called Teapot Dome because they were oil domes. He was leasing these to private oil companies. They were owned by the Navy, by the United States, but he was leasing them to private oil companies. And he became the first presidential cabinet member, Albert Fall, first presidential cabinet member to go to prison. So here we see in this little political cartoon, we see the little teapot here, and it looks big, and it's like a steamroller, and it's rolling through to the White House because this scandal reached to the White House. Since big manufacturers have produced weapons and ammunition that helped win World War I, big business ruled the economic system of the era. All 3 presidents that were elected in the Roaring Twenties were Republicans that believed the nation's prosperity relied on the success of big business. And it was during this time that the United States went from being a debtor nation to a creditor nation. So we went from being in debt to no longer being in debt. In other words, we were giving credit to other places. Calvin Coolidge was the next president during this time period. Because of the corruption during President Harding's administration, Coolidge restored the dignity of the presidency. He called for isolationism in foreign policy, tax cuts, and limited aid to farmers. He was also pro-business, conservative. He also believed in laissez-faire policies. And these ideas we're going to see that they're going to contribute to the economic problems that will come toward the end of the 1920s. His slogan or his motto was "The business of America is business." He limited government spending and stacked the regulatory commissions with people that favored businesses. He also rejected U.S. membership in the League of Nations, and he set high tariffs on imported goods to protect American industry. So you see how that is a way, that's a form of isolationism. That's a way to favor American industry. So legislation under Calvin Coolidge involved the Revenue Acts of 1924 and 1926, which reduced income taxes on mostly on the wealthy. He cut gift, excise, and inheritance taxes, and his policies, unfortunately, did contribute to the stock market crash of 1929 and the depression that followed. We're going to see an Immigration Act in 1924 that prevented immigration from Asia, set quotas on the number of immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere, and funding and will be provided to enforce a ban on other immigrants. So again, isolationism. Remember the idea of isolationism and anti-immigration. This would be the idea of nativism. The Indian Citizenship Act was passed in 1924. Congress enacted this, which granted citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. The right to vote, however, was on a state-by-state basis until 1957. Following Calvin Coolidge, our next president during the 1920s was Herbert Hoover. He believed in rugged individualism. Individuals, people that worked hard, would make America great. He believed in equal opportunities for people, a free education, and a will to succeed. He believed that those things would spur progress and spur the country to greatness. Although the previous two presidents that we saw in the 1920s, although Harding and Coolidge, their policies did contribute to the economic crisis of the 1920s, Hoover is going to get most of the blame in the minds of the American people for the Great Depression. We'll see that as we study more about the Great Depression. He had been a Secretary of Commerce under the previous presidents, and he was the Republican nominee in 1928. He said, look at his quote, "We in America are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the land, in the history of any land." His election seemed to ensure prosperity, that people would be doing well. Yet within months of his election, the stock market crashed and the nation will spiral into the Great Depression. So those words will come back to be very ironic. In this little political cartoon, we see here that the prosperity that he talked about, Hoover prosperity, turned out to be a storm. It turned out to be a negative thing for the country. After the crash of the stock market, Hoover announced that while he would keep the federal budget balanced, he would cut taxes and expand public works spending. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. Remember the 18th Amendment that prohibited alcohol? We're going to see that repealed with the 18th Amendment. That's going to be some important legislation. Notice in the cartoon here, he's saying, yes, it was a noble experiment. Okay, prohibition, it was an experiment, but it didn't work.